Hi, welcome back. This is week 3 of my game engine project. So this week I've mainly been working on the shaders. I haven't had as much time this week to work on the project as I would have liked, but we still have a few things to share. So I got textures working. This is what you can see. I mean, I am missing some textures for this model, so like the eyes is actually just a character, a sheet, a text, a font atlas. So yeah, I mean it's not perfect, but the textures, the ones that we have, are being passed through and rendered onto the model. So that's from a shaders perspective, it's all working. Still no lighting, but at least the shaders are drawing the textures to the model, which I'm really happy with. Like you can see, I just added some colors to the console so that it's easier to differentiate what's happening. But yeah, see, we've got like 4 different textures here, which were loaded. So that's nice. So how did I do this? Okay, so BGFX has its own shader language, essentially. I think it just adopted one that was already written, but it's called, I believe it's called shaderc, which allows a GLSL, so graphics library shader language, um, the what's it called, syntax. So it's got a GLSL syntax, and with a few macros in there, which will let it go to. It will be compiled into a binary file, which can then be run on DirectX, OpenGL, Vulkan, other rendering APIs, right? So I figured this out because I didn't know this. I thought like, oh, you write the shader in whatever whatever language, so like HLSL or GLSL, and then I knew that it was using a bin, but I didn't know why, right? So I figured it out. Essentially, it wasn't that hard to figure out in the beginning, because there's like a few lines in the documentation that's like, oh, you need to compile your shaders with this shaderc executable, and then you'll get a binary file which you can use, right? So that is kind of what this is. So I just pulled the shaderc from the repository, the BGFX repository, but apart from that, there's a few differences. So this is the vertex shader. I'll go into this convention in a minute, but essentially you have your inputs that have to be defined like this. So there's a few caveats with using this shader syntax. You have to define all of your inputs and outputs at the top of the shader. Your inputs and outputs need to be defined in a thing called a varying def.sc. So this is this the right one? We're missing color. Okay, well, it doesn't have everything in there, but you can see like position is set in here. So you've got the type, the name, a colon, and then a position. And if you want to give it a default, you do an equals. I think the defaults are usually used between on the outputs of your vertex shader, right? Because if you don't set it in here, it needs to give something to the fragment shader. So yeah, so I'm not. You might be able to set defaults for here, like if you don't give a position in your vertex buffer, but maybe that doesn't work because maybe it just reads whatever memory you've given it, and if it isn't actually your memory, it'll just read garbage, whatever's in the memory, right, and just give it, and you'll get very weird outcomes. Yeah. So anyway, something I got stuck on for probably about an hour or two was this include. So in the examples, they include this common.sh, which is a shader header file. That just includes this BGFX shader.sh and this common, not the common, sorry, this shaderlib.sh. They essentially have macros in them. right? So you can't use the normal way of doing this in GLSL would be to do a sampler 2D, the name, and then like a value, so like a vector 4, well in this case a vector 2, right? But yeah, so for it to compile, I guess to compile into multiple versions, you have to use this macro, right? Because I guess the HLSL syntax for this is different. So when you're compiling it and you want to compile, say, compile to GLSL and then to HLSL, you need to use this macro, otherwise it'll only work on the syntax that you used, right? So if I just did the normal GLSL, that would work with like OpenGL rendering backend, but it won't work with DirectX. So this took me a little while just because it was like, oh, you haven't defined main. Like it's lacking a main function. It wasn't. It was just like this include was wrong. There was also another bug that, well, not a bug, but this is space sensitive, right? So this won't compile because I have a space here. It looks for, I guess it's just reading the string straight out, right? So it looks for main with no space in between the parentheses, right? So I learned that if you're doing it, that's why I learned. It will be useful. So yeah, and then everything else is pretty much the same. So that's cool. That's how we render the texture. So we have our inputs, our text coordinates and stuff, which are just given by the vertex buffer. I'm going to see if I can find the code real quick here. It'll be in here, and our loader will create it. Vertex layout, right? So data. It's not in here. Where is it? Sorry about that. Our loader. Yeah, so our vertex data has a layout like this, right? So we have all of our parameters. So we position, normal, texture, color, and then we assign attributes to those, which is why that A underscore position, A underscore normal. We tell them what type they are, so that's really telling the GPU how many bytes are in each field, right? So this property is made up of 3 floats, so it knows like the size of it. I think there's probably something in the background that actually times this by the size of this. And then it will be like that's the stride for that attribute, right? And then we give our texture stuff, and that's essentially how it passes it through. So they all come into here. This runs, and then we put stuff into these, which are then picked up by this, which then has a macro here, which will just declare the sampler, and then this will actually sample the texture with the coordinates. And then you end up with our texture on the model. So that's nice. That works. I think I've rambled on about this a bit too much. So I will talk about the problems that I faced with it. So, oh yeah, that's right. So we have these .sc files, which stand for source code, probably, I'd imagine. You could have them anything. I started out with txt, but I realized that the convention on the repository was .sc, probably because they have like, I don't know why actually. But yeah, they need to be compiled with this shaderc. So I wrote a little script in Python, just because Python's super handy for this kind of thing, which takes in all of the .sc files. So here, so gets all the files, splits them, uses all the sc files, and then it runs. We've given it arguments here, which we'll print out later if it doesn't succeed. And then we run shaderc on all of those files. So because we have like 3 shaders, and both of those have a vertex and fragment shader, that's 6 shaders, right? I don't want to have to go into PowerShell or or command line or terminal to run this 6 times myself, right? So I just wrote this quick script to convert them all, and because they're like known in the Visual Studio project in here, they're all just copied on build. I set to always copy. They're always copied on build to the output directory, so they're always used, which is super handy. Now, I also ran into another problem where BGFX only supports certain formats of textures. This is because some of the rendering backends only support certain type of textures. So they said all rendering engines backends, sorry, only support these kind of textures, so that the library is fully cross-platform, right? It can render to any backend given you've given it the correct thing. It's not, yeah, you understand. So I had it working, but I couldn't see my texture. I was like, what's going on? What's happening? But it turned out that, yeah, the texture wasn't in the right format, which is where this other tool called Texture C comes in, and that converts. So I'm still in the process of writing a script for this. I need to write a script that will take all of your textures and convert them. Now, there's a few problems with this, is because it was easy to do with the shaders, because at the minute all my shaders are in the same folder, and I know where they're going to be, but they could be anywhere, right? These are going to be the default shaders for the engine, but the engine is actually just a program at the minute. Actually, let me rephrase that. The editor is a program for making other programs, right? Games are just programs. So to find all the textures that the user have inputted into this program is kind of different to the problem with the shaders, right? Because they could be in any of the assets files. So I still need to do that. You would have think the easiest way is to, when you import the model, you would look at all the textures that are attached to that model and convert them if they're not in the right format, which is great, right? Because at compile time, that's done when you're making the game, right? So it's not done at runtime when someone's playing the game, because you just wouldn't want the textures being reformatted while you're playing the game. Performance overheads, lag, all the bad stuff, right? So you want it to do it when they import it. The second issue is sometimes, like this model I have here, the texture paths were hard coded into the model, right? So it was whoever made it. I can't remember who made it, but this path down here was different to the one that I have on my machine. So you might not be able to find it. So I started making this assets window that we'll be able to import the models into. If you can't find the textures, you can just import them into here. You'll be able to make materials and stuff. But yeah, I think that's kind of all I got up to this week. It actually was quite a lot of work getting the shaders working, just because I had no idea of these little quirks and how it works. I find that there wasn't like a great amount of documentation behind it. There was like 4 lines of documentation explaining that you need to use use the shader C, and then there was like 5 bullet points of all the different things that you had to use. But I had this problem where the includes weren't working. Yeah, there was just loads of different fiddly things that took me a while. Like maybe one of the files was an outdated version, something. Just really annoying. But we got there in the end. I feel good about it. I really want to get lighting working, because I feel like if I could get lighting working, or when I get lighting working, it'll feel a lot nicer. Like having everything lit flat, it just looks really boring. And it feels like I have a lot of pieces that are like half complete. I really need to work on polishing them Yeah, I started making some tests for like the loader, resource loader. It checks that like a message was logged if the file is of the wrong, it doesn't exist and stuff. So I'm gonna work on adding a lot more tests so I'm more confident about the changes that I'm making. Yeah, okay, I'll stop rambling because I think I've shown like everything that's interesting. Yeah, okay. Well, thanks for watching. Sorry it wasn't a hugely interesting episode, but hopefully next week we'll come back stronger with some cooler changes. All right, thanks.